Fantastic. I'm sorry, Pedro. Please, your question.
No, but the question is, so we don't need any more Slido in our mobile phones.
It doesn't work, or?
No, I mean the mobile phone, but you said that since we have a stream starting soon, should be sufficient or
Water in a distant ocean yesterday. The water you see in a river may have been snow on a mountaintop a few days earlier. Water is everywhere, in the atmosphere, on the land, in the ocean and underground. But only 0.0125% of the world's water resources are accessible freshwater.
We feel the impacts of climate change mainly through water. Either there's not enough water, or too much of it, or water at the wrong time and in the wrong place. Seasons have shifted, monsoon rains have become more intense, glacial recession has accelerated, rainfall patterns have changed, and mountains have lost some of their permafrost, which is so important to stabilize their rock slopes.
Since the early 1900s, the average global temperature has risen by about 1 degree Celsius. This doesn't seem like much, but any rise in temperature accelerates the water cycle, resulting in substantial changes in the patterns of precipitation. This has massively affected our global water resources and made the availability of water a lot less predictable. It has caused extreme weather conditions, impacting our health and food security and exacerbating refugee dynamics and political instability. It also harms ecosystems and societies, and threatens biodiversity and sustainable social-economic development. At the same time, demographic changes expose even more people to extreme weather events.
The world's growing population is a further challenge. Water use has increased six-fold over the past century and continues rising by about 1% per year. Climate change, along with the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, will not only aggravate the situation in countries already experiencing water stress, but also generate water-related problems in areas that have not yet been affected. Estimates suggest that an additional 380 million people could face water stress by mid-century. 4 billion people, or half of the world population, already face water scarcity for at least 1 month per year. Securing access to fresh water is one of the most pressing global issues of the 21st century. We have to find ways to use water more efficiently to both serve our population and preserve stocks for future generations.
Humans will have to adapt. 97% of extreme weather events are water-related. Adapting our lives and policies to the ever-changing water cycle is a continuous challenge, but it is also a solution. Specific measures, such as early warning systems for climate-induced disaster risks, nature-based flood protection measures, or development of drought-resistant crops, can help us to cope with climate variability and change. Other measures, like protection of wetlands, conservation agriculture, or reforestation, help to store carbon in the soil and in plants. More efficient wastewater treatment can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and produce biogas as a source of renewable energy. We can adapt to the effects of climate change and even reduce greenhouse gas emissions through the way water is managed.
Let's join hands to find innovative, local, and regional solutions to address and to adapt to these global challenges, to secure water for future generations while coping with climate change.
Dear participants, a warm welcome to our working session on managing water in a changing climate in search of actionable solutions. I would of course also like to welcome the audience which is joining us online, either through Zoom or YouTube. And Daniel Maselli and myself, we will today co-moderate this session, and I will quickly want to introduce my colleague Daniel. He's working for SDC in the global program Water as Senior Policy Advisor and focal point for the Water Network. Among many other things, he's a very active colleague. He has launched a number of youth-related projects and initiatives at the nexus between water and climate change. And among them, the composition of the world's largest postcard with over 125 messages of youth on climate change.
Thank you, Manfred. A warm welcome from my side as well. I think we will soon start, but quickly, my colleague, he also has some specialities. He's very active in mountain areas, especially also in themes of water management, climate change, and glaciology. As a background, he has environmental sciences from the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, and he joined STC already in 2008, so he has also long-standing experience in our own institution. So now we would quickly like to display to you what we have prepared as a menu for the next short 2 hours. We have set objectives. 2, we would like to increase our understanding on interrelations and the interdependencies of the climate system and the water cycle. We think that this is the basis for a better understanding and for searching solutions, which is the next and second objective. And solutions are only valuable if they're capable to be put in action. So actionable solution and in different contexts and relevant, of course, to development cooperation, which is the reason why we're gathering these 2 days here in Geneva. The setup is quite simple. We have 3 parts. We are already in the middle of the first one with the video that you saw. We will soon have a science-based dialogue between a climatologist and a hydrologist to set the scene so that we are on the same page, understanding at least part of the scientific rationale. Then we will make a deep dive and have 3 live connections to 3 different locations, as you can see, and we will have case studies presented, on which we will have panelists reacting, which will then also join us here on stage. And finally, we will try to draw some conclusions. We will not do this alone and not only with the panelists. We will also try to get your wisdom and crowd intelligence and crowd knowledge through Slido. So we hope that you have already participated in the first poll on origin and regions of activity of yours. And with this, I think we will start and go to the dialogue. Manfred.
Thank you very much. So it's my pleasure to welcome 2 renowned scientists on climate change and water. I welcome Christian Huckel. He's a professor at the Department of Geography at the University of Zurich, and he leads the research group Environment and Climate, Impacts, Risks and Adaptation. He's also a lead author of the IPCC's 6th assessment report, working specifically on the chapter on Central and South America and also on the cross-chapter on mountains. And then also warm welcome to Professor Markus Stoffel. He's a full professor at the University of Geneva. His research focuses on climate change impacts and risks in the Anthropocene with the aim to understand, document and quantify fundamental environmental processes and the drivers of change. He's a natural hazard expert with more than 20 years of experiences in integrated management of landslides, flash floods, debris flow, and glacier lake outburst floods. So these 2 scientific colleagues will give us an insight first in what are the consequences of climate change to the water cycle, and secondly, an insight how we can adapt to these impacts and consequences. Markus and Christian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction and a very warm welcome to all of you here, ladies and gentlemen, in the room, but also to the audience following this session online. Next slide, please. Next. Planet Earth is warming. According to the latest report of the IPCC, warming on a global average has already exceeded 1 degree Celsius, as you've seen in the introductory video. Warming is not the same everywhere. Whereas oceans warm less than the global average, polar and mountain regions are warming much faster. If I take the example of Switzerland, for instance, warming has exceeded already since the beginning of the 20th century 2 degrees, and the last decade was 2.5 degrees warmer than the 20th century average. What you also see on the graph that is displayed and the temperatures that are increasing, you see that the increase is at an accelerated speed as we come closer to the present day. And you will also realize that we are approaching the 1.5 degree target set in Paris rather quickly. So if no severe instantaneous measures are taken, it will be difficult for us to reach the goals defined in Paris. Next slide, please. This warming in mountain environments and in polar regions also has significant impacts. And glaciers are unfortunately a very good example to show the consequences of this warming. You see here on this slide an image of Muir Glacier in Alaska, a picture taken in 1941. Next slide. And a picture of 2004. If I would add a picture of today, the situation would even be worse. Next slide, please. As glaciers are melting, they're contributing water to river systems. So in the first step, while the glaciers are still big, this additional melt will result in larger runoff. But there is one point in time when glaciers are retreating, are getting smaller and smaller, where the additional melt will not result in more water, but on the contrary, in less water. This is what is shown here for what we often refer to as the third pole, the third area where we have large ice masses besides the North and the South Pole, that's high mountain Asia. And what you see here on this graph are the approximate years at which scientists think that this peak water, the maximum runoff, will occur. As you see on this slide, in several regions of high mountain Asia, peak water was already in the past. So what we have today is already less than what we used to have. But you also see that in other regions, especially in the Karakoram, just to mention one example, we will still increase runoff as glaciers melt, and we will reach this peak water later in the century. Next slide, please. This has a series of consequences because we have roughly 600 million people living directly in mountain environments and 1.8 billion people worldwide depending on waters coming from the mountains. And if we go from past conditions to current conditions to future conditions, you will see that depending on where you are, you will be more or less depend on these water resources coming from mountain environments. And regions like the Indian subcontinent have already been suffering from decreasing water resources, but will even more so suffer from decreasing water availability. This also has some consequences on the ground, I think, Christian.
Yes, Markus, absolutely. Next slide, please. We know that the impacts are felt locally, and also much of adaptation has to be implemented locally. So let's go and have a look at Peru. Peru, the high Andes are the water towers, as Markus has mentioned in the global picture. They are the water towers feeding the large coastal cities. Now what we have done here, this is a result of recently concluded research project where we looked at how glacier melt changes water availability. And you have to know that in Peru, as in many other regions, you have very long extended dry region season, like almost half a year, where glacier melt contributes up to 50% and even sometimes more to water availability. Now what you can see, we have looked not only at different climate warming scenarios and climate models, but also on the socioeconomic scenarios, which are very important for the water demand. Now each of the colored bar you see represents a socioeconomic scenario which we have developed with local stakeholders. Now the top row is indicating at an annual basis, which is not yet as dramatic, and this is towards 2050. However, if you look at the lowest row, which is the dry season, there you see that you have dramatic changes, reduction in water availability. And you also see that at this time, if in the dry season, also the socioeconomic scenarios become very important. So we have substantial differences between these different socioeconomic scenarios, which translate into water demand. Next slide. We also want to know about the economic and monetary loss related to retreat of glacier and reduction of water availability. The loss of water has very concrete consequences, especially for agriculture, which is to a large degree is also irrigation dependent, but also for hydropower and for domestic use. And what we calculate is actually really was a surprise also to us, because what we have seen for a catchment of medium size, we have seen that the annual losses by 2050 are in the order of $200 to $300 million annually. And just to set that in context, this is around 10 to 20% of GDP of this region. However, we also are very aware it's not only about money. If you look at the lower left, you see people, local people, whom we had accompanied to the glaciers. We have a very intimate relation to mountains and glaciers. And for them, this is a big loss. And actually what they tell is if the glaciers are gone, people will also have gone. Next slide. Now Marcus will tell us more about droughts, because droughts are also an extremely important aspect, of course, of water availability.
Thank you, Christian. So we're not only speaking about the temperature changes. In a warmer climate, we will also have a tendency for more extreme events to occur. So we were both speaking of this water availability that is changing, so less water in the rivers. People also use the groundwater, which may not necessarily fill up naturally again, or at least not at the timescales that are available. A warmer climate also has a tendency to produce more and more severe droughts, and warmer temperatures also have a tendency to favor evaporation. So if we combine all these different elements, we have, unfortunately, to say that climate change will worsen droughts worldwide. Next slide, please. So in combination between the lesser amounts of water that are available in rivers and the droughts that are exacerbating, this illustration here from the IPCC shows that water management will become a challenge in many areas of the world by 2050. So water scarcity will be a high or a very strong challenge in many areas, be it on the Arabian Peninsula, be it in the United States, be it in India, be it in China, be it in South Africa, or even in Latin America. Next slide. Paradoxically, we might say it's not only too little water, so an increase in drought severity, drought duration. In a warmer climate, we can also transport more humidity, and whenever the conditions are met, the rainfall events that we can have can be more intense as well. So record-breaking floods, very unfortunately, are likely to become the new normal. Next slide, please. So if we look to the historical period in the absence of climate change, a 10-year precipitation event in statistical terms occurs once every 10 years. The more we warm the climate, however, and if we would go to a plus 4 degrees Celsius warming, what used to be a once in 10-year event would occur almost 3 times every decade. So every degree of warming matters. Every degree of warming does not only make the floods more extreme, but also the droughts more extreme. And this obviously also has consequences on the ground, Christian.
Yes, Marcus, and here the next slide. Early warning systems are considered and has been assessed to be a very cost-effective solution response to extreme events such as floods. And they are implementable on the ground. However, I think that's usually they are more complex than many people sometimes think. An early warning system is actually a complex system, and it has to start on the left-hand side. You see that's the whole sort of science-based hazards and risk analysis, but also, of course, with the local perceptions of risk. And this, for instance, is an example also from Peru, navigation, risk and evacuation map. Then you have stations, sometimes in very challenging conditions, technical instruments, and in the middle, The circle, this is the people. Early warning systems are with the people and for the people, and many early warning system actually has failed on that ground. On the right-hand side, we see an example. This is 1 year ago, the big Chamoli disaster flood in Uttarakhand in India, where unfortunately no such early warning system was in place, and more than 200 people lost their lives. However, next slide, we know that the world has become very complex and also very interconnected. I think we all know these days and weeks with the war in Ukraine, what are the consequences for the world. Now here what you see, this is looking back the past decades and looking at events that produced loss in food production. And the brown circles, those are related to droughts. Blue are other climatically related, and then we also have non-climatically related droughts. What you see, they are becoming bigger and more frequent, and this is clearly what we also will see in the future. And this interconnection of different crises, which we are currently, also with the pandemic, we are experiencing, this will be a major challenge for the future because they will be increasingly difficult to manage. Now the next slide. In terms of adaptation, I've brought you here another figure from the IPCC recently released. IPCC has a bit of tendency to produce rather complex figures, so I try to simplify this a little bit. What are the adaptation options we have in the water sector? And I've highlighted here 4 adaptation options. One is improved agronomic practices. Another one is changes in cropping patterns and cropping systems. Then irrigation, on-farm irrigation, water management, and eventually water and soil moisture conservation. Now, if you look in the highlighted red bar, you see first for current conditions, we have good evidence. And I mean, behind these there are dozens and if not hundreds studies supporting this figure. So we have good evidence that there is improved outcomes when we apply these measures. If you look at the future, and especially at higher levels of warming, we see at the red part that we have significant residual risk remaining. What are residual risks? Residual risks are those that remain after you have done an adaptation options. And we see with higher, especially below 2 degrees, those adaptation measures become ineffective or less effective, sometimes not feasible, and substantial residual risk, negative consequences, losses and damage remain. Now Markus will introduce the first set of conclusions.
Thank you very much. As you've seen on some of the previous slides, floods and droughts have become more likely. They occur more frequently on average. They're also becoming more severe, and it's because of us. It's because we are heating the planet. It's due to climate change induced by humans. One other point that is very important to mention, those who are hit most are normally not those who have emitted. It's mostly the most vulnerable people living in regions outside Europe, outside North America, that are hit most by floods and droughts. The more we emit in the future, the more we allow further warming, water-related risks will increase further, as we've also seen. The water sector, which is the topic of today, plays a very key role for adaptation to climate change. If we manage to get the right measures implemented, there are multiple benefits, but there is obviously also a risk of maladaptation. Next slide, and over to you, Christian.
We have seen that with the last slide, that effectiveness of adaptation options, and this relates now specifically to the water sectors, falls sharply beyond 2 degrees. This is very important and actually also applies to other sectors than water. One of the key messages that came out of the IPCC report, Working Group 2, is that we are not only not on track on mitigation, this is Working Group 1, we are also not on track with adaptation. And the report makes the point that the next 10 years are critical to upscale adaptation. Also, an important point is about the interconnected risks and crises. So we call for, that might call for a rethinking of adaptation, actually work more rigorously toward climate resilient development to achieve the necessary level of resilience to climate change and connected crises and shocks. And clearly much more efforts are needed in terms of adaptation, and more transformative adaptation is needed.
Thank you very much for your attention, and we're happy to take your questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Markus and Christian. An inspiring presentation, even if you present also a kind of a daunting reality, which will be difficult to tackle. First of all, I would like to invite everybody who is here in the room and also joining us online to ask questions on Slido. And while you are doing that, I will start with two questions. The first one to Markus. I think you have mentioned maladaptation. Could you elaborate what you exactly mean with that? Maybe with an example?
Okay, yeah, it's maybe easiest to give an example. Some of you might know the flood mitigation measures that have been designed and partly implemented in Ho Chi Minh City. So in Ho Chi Minh City, there was this threat of sea level rise and coastal flooding. So the urban planners had decided to put a flood evacuation system into place, a sewer system into place. They used the information that they had. Unfortunately, the reality is that the floods that have to be expected are larger than what the initial plans thought they would be. And this has obviously several consequences. So if you're in the city now, and if you have these systems that should evacuate the floods, they're not big enough. So the areas that were not at a risk of flood before, but now have the sewer systems, they have a risk of being flooded. And the second downside is that the local population was, in a sense, believing that they would go to a safe place. So there has been heavy urbanization of these sectors. So it's, on the one hand, the hazard that is larger than anticipated, and then also now with more people living in these areas, the exposure and hence also the vulnerability that are affected. So that's maybe one example where adaptation was meant to improve the situation, but at the end of the day, it probably did the contrary.
Thank you very much. And then I have a second question for Christian. You mentioned that we need transformative adaptation, that like the incremental adaptation is not sufficient. Can you explain us in some easy words what you mean with transformative adaptation?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I think actually it's really important that we bring transformation down to the ground and not stay somewhere in the clouds. So in principle, but that might still sound theoretical, in principle transformation is when you transform the underlying system, but I think it's easier with an example. For instance, an early warning system, I think in many instances is rather incremental, because you have some technique on the ground and some people know to evacuate. Or maybe, for instance, a retention dam or a deflection dam for a flood is a typical incremental measure. I think the ultimate transformation is usually relocation of people, because that really transforms the system. But also, for instance, diversification of livelihoods can be considered as a transformation measures.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to Slido, and we have some questions here, but I think we could still receive some further questions. I'll start with this one. What happened if we do not manage to catch up on the adaptation in the next 10 years?
What happens? What happens if we don't reduce the emissions? No, I mean, I think it's a matter that we just need to realize, and I think this is really the new message, also an important message coming out of the IPCC, that this urgency is not only in the mitigation area, but also in the adaptation. I mean, what happens, of course, we have more negative consequences, we have more losses, and we have more damages, and I think we should do all possible. And the adaptation, I think it's mostly, I mean, it's not easy, we know that, but it's possible, it's feasible. And it's often not so much politically contested like mitigation. And we should take an opportunity that there is political will to do adaptation, but we need to upscale. And at the end of the day, it costs money. This is very clear, and politicians need to realize adaptation is not just happening. We have a lot of autonomous adaptation already, but we need to upscale, and this needs some effort.
Thank you very much. There is a very simple but interesting question here, and I think it's very worthwhile because many people can get confused about floods and droughts and having both at the same time. So the question is, can you briefly explain why there are floods despite drought?
Yeah, so the general tendency in many areas of the world is that you have drier seasons. Even if you have drier seasons and rain on fewer days, whenever it rains in a warmer climate, the atmosphere can hold more humidity before it will reach the dew point, so before precipitation will start. So overall, we have shifts in the seasons in which it is drier or wetter. If I take the example from here, we're in Geneva, we will have a tendency for wetter winters. That does not make that huge difference because winters are quite wet anyway. We will have wetter conditions, rainfall higher up, so the water will be gone faster. But we will have drier summers, and without the contribution of the glaciers, with less snow melt, we have less water in the rivers, we have less precipitation, we have warmer temperatures. So even in a country like Switzerland, we will have the conditions for drought. But then even if in total over the summer season we have less precipitation, whenever it rains, there's a higher probability for downpours. But if you add the totals that fall within a season or within a year, you can still be at less millimeters than what we used to have in the past. So it's going to extremes in all directions, and that's sometimes difficult to understand. It may sound like a paradox, but at the end of the day, climate change means, with respect to the water sector, more extremes, dry extremes, wet extremes, with all the negative consequences.
Thank you very much. Again, we have an interesting question. We are always highlighting the negative impacts of climate change. So the question here is, can you also highlight possible positive impacts of climate change for vulnerable communities?
Yeah, I think sure. In the IPCC, this is extensively assessed, and you have some positive outcomes or impacts, but overall the negatives are dominating. For instance, the Nordic regions, they have positive effects in terms of agriculture. For instance, more production is possible because of the warmer temperature. For the mountains, there's also a question whether, for instance, in summer you have positive effects in terms of tourism, for instance, because more people might want to go to the mountains because the lowlands become too hot. So there are positives, but I can tell you, unfortunately, the negatives are clearly dominating, especially at higher degrees of warming.
Thank you very much. I think we are at the end of this session. Personally, I think I have learned a lot about the urgency, about also that things are coming faster and are becoming more severe, and that we don't have a lot of time to act. So thanks a lot for these insights, and with that,
thank you very much.
Come to the next segment.
Yes, now we're moving to this part 2, the deep dive, with the case studies, and then also having our panelists to react on them and add on the questions we will pose after each case study. So that is what we are in now, and the first case study will be presented by Stanislava Dodjeva. She's a national program officer, as you can see, for SDC in North Macedonia. She's a person knowledgeable in technical sciences, and she's been also working as a designer engineer in the Water Management Institute. So also looking into solutions, technical solutions. She's also been working at the Department of the National Public Utility for Water Management, so also having an institutional perspective. And now at SDC, she's focusing on environment and infrastructure. So I think we can now listen to the presentation that will again highlight one of the two sides of the medal, too much or too little water, and she will present us a flood issue and how to deal with that in a region in North Macedonia. So you have the floor, and thanks for joining live from your country. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a great, please return back if it is possible. Yes, it is a great honor and pleasure for me to be with all of you today and to have the opportunity to present you the Swiss-funded project Improving Resilience to Floods in the Polog region. Next slide, please. North Macedonia is a relatively small country that has a population of about 2 million, and it is located in the southern part of the Western Balkans. The country is particularly vulnerable to risk of floods, and recently 3 major disasters hit the country in 2015 and 2016 alone. The frequency of flooding, however, is higher in the northwestern Polog region than anywhere else in the country. The main reasons are the mountainous topography of the area and also very dense hydrographic network of torrential stream beds. The potential for this disaster to raise is more than certain, as the climate change is increasing the frequency of the extreme weather events, including torrential rainfalls. Just one more statistics, that there are 320,000 people living in this region in 9 municipalities. Next slide, please. On 3rd of August 2015, after torrential rains lasting less than 2 hours, the region was hit by a combination of flash floods and landslides that caused death and damage at a greater scale that most people can remember. Next slide. 6 people died, including children. Šipkovica village was buried in mud and rubble from the collapsed former dam site. City of Tetovo was completely inundated, and the regional road from Tetovo to the Kosovo border was blocked by sludge with a height of, in some places, even more than 4 meters. The material damage caused by this disaster has been estimated to at $21.5 million, but the human costs are still being paid to this day. Next slide, please. These tragic consequences of the extreme floods revealed the major deficiency throughout all the components of the overall flood management system. The challenges and gaps have been identified, and they are presented on 2 slides, but I will be focusing only on few of them because of the limited time that I have. So rapid and non-risk sensitive urban development is very typical for the entire Polog region. There is increasing percentage of impermeable built areas, such as residential and commercial buildings, streets and roads, and paved parking slots. And that is all done mainly on the cost of natural areas like floodplains, wetlands, forest, and other green areas that have very high water retention, but also infiltration capacity. And the final result is that the increased surface runoff and growing urban flooding. Next slide, please. There was no early warning system introduced in the Polog region, and at the country level, there is no working public alert system. The victims of this tragic incident or flood in 2015 were women, children, and also elderly men who didn't receive timely support or assistance, and they lacked also knowledge, I would say also skills and mobility to react upon the situation. It was very obvious that there was no lack of sensitivity to the needs of the most vulnerable groups. The behavior of the local communities, like building houses and other structures in the floodplain, so just next to the river, or dumping the waste along the riverbank and illegal and uncontrolled logging, show very clearly that there is a very limited awareness among the local communities, and they are not aware that actually in this way of behavior, they're increasing already very high risk of floods in the region. Next slide, please. So in order to address this growing challenge of flooding in the Polog region and also throughout the country, and also socioeconomic consequences, SDC and SECO jointly, they are providing a support to a 6-year project that includes flood mitigation and also resilient building measures. This project is implemented by UNDP office in North Macedonia. Next slide, please. The project was designed in a way that the components should actually respond to the identified challenges and gaps, and also in the same time to respect the principles of Sendai Framework Disaster Risk Reduction, and also to meet the requirements of the EU Flood Directive. So what the project will ensure or already has ensured: the knowledge and understanding of the region flood risk are significantly improved and shared among the authorities in charge, institutions, civil sector, and local communities. Flood risk management plan has been elaborated in a multi-institutional and also community-based process, and includes the needs of the vulnerable social groups. In order to improve the risk governance, an intermunicipal and cooperation platform has been established. The project analyzed several risk transfer mechanisms, and including the improved assurance scheme, and the optimal one will be selected for the country, will be selected in a process of national policy dialogue. Next slide, please. The project will also support selected municipalities in the region to prepare flood risk-based urban plans. Also will support implementation of contemporary structural and non-structural measures in order to reduce the adverse effect of future floods. The monitoring system has been already improved with installation of 31 monitoring stations, while the early warning and public alert system is currently under development. And the last point has been already mentioned. The last slide, please. So on this slide, I'm showing the planned measures for reduction of the risk from floods, but future floods in the village of Šipkovica. The works will start mid of April, and that's why there are no photos from the site, but only a map taken from the technical design. The interventions include structural and non-structural measures. In first group, we see that there will be a structure that will divert the surplus water in a natural terrain depression, and there will be temporarily stored. Then downstream, another structure will be built with a task to retain and hold the sediment in order not to endanger the downstream part. And the torrential stream bed will be regulated through the village using natural materials like rock and stones. Nature-based solutions will be called for help. So there will be afforestation. You can see the marked area where the afforestation will be done, or grass planting where that is needed. In order to stabilize the steep slopes and landslides, willow fascines and gabions will be installed or implemented. So it is expected that through implementation of these all these measures, but also with increased awareness of the public and the local communities, that the risk of future floods for the village Šipkovica will be significantly reduced. And the last slide is, thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so this was the presentation of the first case study. Now, let me please call our panelists on the stage here and also welcome those who are virtually connected. I'll start with those physically here. So, Rupa Mukherjee, please join us here on stage. And we also ask Marie-Jeanne Senghor to join here. Please take a floor next to me. Rupa is probably known by quite a number of people present here in the room and possibly connected. She's working at the Helvetas Swiss Intercorporation, where she heads the Advisory Services Department. But I think those who read the IPCC reports have, of course, come across her role as a lead author, both for the 5th and the 6th assessment report, and especially on adaptation. So we have the right person with us. I think that through that we can really deeply dive into the issue and also into the solution finding. With Marie-Jeanne Senghor, we have somebody from Geneva, currently doing her PhD here, so great that we have the next generation already ready to take over in a little while. She's working at the Pole of Environmental Governance and Territorial Development, quite a special unit, and she's having a master's degree in development, which she took in Egypt, and then an engineering degree from her home country in Dakar. Welcome to both of you. And now also equally welcome, although distant in geography, we have 3 more panelists. First, Isabella Koziel. She is a deputy director of the ICIMOD, based in Nepal, the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. She joined it in 2021 as the Deputy Director General. She's having a lots of competencies and experiences, both linked to water, but also transboundary settings and in the fields of water. Also on biodiversity and land and ecosystem degradation. So it will be interesting as mountain systems play a big role, and the place where she is currently working and active is also called the Third Pole. So welcome, Isabella, from Kathmandu at the late time of the day. Then I would like to welcome Amanda Lake. We are really pleased that you have joined us to give us also the insight from a private sector perspective, working at Jacobs Engineering, and you're also linked to water, looking into freshwater and wastewater treatment. And since it is a globally active company, it will also be good to see what are differences between the Global South and the Global North. So welcome for joining us. And then a colleague of us, if I may say, Pablo Basabe. He's based in Bangkok, where he is the Senior Regional Advisor for Disaster Risk Reduction at our embassy. He is actually a person that has worked already on 4 continents. His origins are more in South and Central America, where he was really involved in lots of addressing the disasters, both from conceptual and planning perspective, but also from concrete reaction in case after the disasters took place. So we have an insight from a person familiar also with planning and UN organizations, and that might also shed light on solutions from that perspective. So with this, I think the panel is complete, and I hand over to Manfred for another group of people.
Thank you. Yes, we don't only have panelists, we have additional resource people that can answer specific questions. I would like to start with Carolina Adler, and I would also like to ask you to take a seat here. She is the Executive Director of the Mountain Research Initiative, which is a global research coordination network tasked with coordinating scientific research activities and supporting collaborations on global change research in mountains. She also co-leads, or has co-led, the cross-chapter paper on mountains and contributes as a lead author to the technical summary and summary for policymakers of the Working Group 2 report of IPCC, which was just issued at the end of February this year. Very warm welcome. And then we have two more resource persons who are joining virtually. We have Daniel Kohl. He's a senior disaster risk management specialist with the World Bank's Global Practice for Urban Resilience and Land, and he's leading projects to strengthen disaster risk management in Europe and Central Asia. He's based in Geneva, but unfortunately right now he is traveling in Central Asia. So he represents also the World Bank in its institutional interactions with the World Meteorological Organization and the Global Framework for Climate Services. Welcome, Daniel. And then we have also a third resource person, which is Maria Ana Borges. She is Water for Landscapes Manager and at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and works in the water and land management team. Through her role at IUCN, she drives learning and innovation on the deployment of effective and inclusive water management strategies in productive landscapes. She's also involved in implementing IUCN's work on transboundary water governance and leading research on transboundary finance. So welcome to the whole team now, which is complete.
Thank you, Manfred. So let's now dive into the discussion. We have a guiding question, the first one for the stimulation of reflection. I asked the technique to please show the first guiding question. It's on bottlenecks or gaps that are limiting us to implement and have adapting measures in place to strengthen the resilience. I think of systems, of communities, and Stanislava has shown us, of course, a number of shortcomings and difficulties in the planning sector. And now I would like to we will have open discussions after these presentations. Manfred and myself refrain from giving predefined questions to the panelists. So it is a bit on a spontaneous basis. We would like you to react first, and then we will also take up again questions from the audience, both those who are virtually connected and those in the room. So through Slido, please, if you have questions or suggestions and solutions on which you would like the panel to react, please use this opportunity. Rupa, can I give you a first time the floor?
Yes, thanks a lot, Daniel. It's been only an afternoon, but it feels like such a rich day. We had really interesting inputs from people confronting climate impacts, both as managers of resources, so the mayor, but also the departmental head from India, and the two very rich presentations just now, digesting a whole chapter of impacts of climate change on water and what to do about it from a particular context. What is very important is that we feel the impacts everywhere. You hear the voices from every continent, we hear the voices, we experience it here, and responding to some of the questions that were there in the online, what is very obvious is that the costs of adaptation become higher the more we delay. So the cost of inaction is very high, socially and financially, but cost of delayed adaptation action is also almost trebling, 3 times. And from a water sector perspective, the 6th assessment report is very clear and conclusive that many options close. With even a half-degree warming in temperatures, 60% of the adaptation options that were assessed in the IPCC report come from the water sector. So that's the sector where we are responding the most. About a third of them are maladaptive. So we are not able to see things in an integrated way. A community upstream adapts. It has a negative consequence on a community downstream. One sector adapts, so you build a wall or you redesign your sewerage system, but another sector suffers, which is the flooding or the urban planning. So there is not enough integration, there is not enough information at the local level where decisions need to be made. And many of the adaptation options in the water sector would start to close with even 0.5 degree additional warming on average at a global level. So the criticality, the urgency of the matter, we try to communicate with using every word and every means at the disposal of the IPCC. But I think as people who work at the front lines, we also hear it all the time from the communities. And most of the impacts of climate change are being currently felt through the water sector. So it's a critical sector where we need to bring together all our resources. And still, at the moment, we continue to work in very siloed manners. And I think the other speakers would probably further develop that. Thanks.
Thank you, Rupa, for being concise and at the same time concrete. I would like to turn myself virtually to you, Isabella, in the Himalayas and Hindu Kush. ICIMOD is working with 8 different countries, so I wonder where are the gaps and the bottlenecks when you want to improve the resilience of lots of these vulnerable communities in these mountain areas, remote areas. What is ICIMOD doing? How do you feel there are solutions that can improve the situation?
Thank you, Daniel. And yes, speaking to you today from Nepal, and we work for the 8 countries of the Hindu Kush Himalaya, which of course is the source of 10 of Asia's major river systems, upon which about 3 billion people depend. So addressing these bottlenecks and gaps is really extremely important. And this is something we've been doing for the last 39 years that we've been operating. In terms of some of the bottlenecks and how we're trying to resolve them, we are a knowledge center, so we try to translate the science in a way that is understandable by planners and decision makers. We have a lot more work to do there. But the gulf between the science and the solutions is still vast, and we have not got much time to fill that. But delivering usable information and practical solutions really is at a premium moving forwards. Also, another major bottleneck we see is policy and institutional inertia. There simply are not the policy incentives, especially at that local level. The other day, I just drove down one of the major rivers, Trisuli, just outside Kathmandu. There is major soil erosion, there is major sand mining, gravel mining, pollution. It is not in a good state. Getting those policy incentives right is something we want to work far more on. Then 2 final things, working in an interdisciplinary way. Effective adaptation does require working across all sectors. We're not very good at it. We've got to get a lot better at it. So that's one thing we have been trying to do. We work in interdisciplinary ways, but it's not easy. The incentives are not always there. And of course, finance. There isn't enough finance going into adaptation. It has been mentioned time and again. Even the finance mechanisms that exist are slow. It took us 5 years to become a regional implementing entity for the Adaptation Fund. And we are still not got the projects on board. The finance flows, the systems, the processes are too slow, given the severity of the challenge. Thank you. Back to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Isabella, and also for being frank in own limitations. I think I can subscribe to the difficulties of cross-sectoral approaches within our own institution. Let us move to the next presentation. We won't always make full rounds of feedbacks by the panelists, but yes.
Yes, there is one question that I want to address to one of our resource persons. In the presentation of Stanislava, we have heard about the potential of nature-based solutions. And with Mariana Borges, we have specialists of nature-based solutions. And again, maybe you could enlighten us a little bit. What are the specific gaps and bottlenecks? Why do we still see so many gray solutions instead of nature-based solutions? How do you convince your stakeholders to go for nature-based solutions?
Thanks so much, Manfred, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's truly a pleasure to be with this group and listening to these very interesting and thought-provoking presentations. Indeed, it's an urgent and you know, we need to act now. And I think what nature-based solutions does is actually, and I think importantly, moves us so much away from the perception of so much the negative and looking at how can we solve the problems that we have right now at hand. Just to clarify, because I think we talk about nature-based solutions, but perhaps just to give a bit of a framing of what IUCN means by it, is that basically they are the actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems so as to help address societal challenges, and one clear and immediate societal challenge being climate change. I think the problem with that you've actually started by pointing out, one of the big challenges that we have with uptake of nature-based solutions is the reliance, the extensive reliance of the water sector on gray and built infrastructure. And I think one of the big issues that needs to be really addressed is understanding how we move away, or not necessarily away, but we complement the conventional approaches and working with gray infrastructure to bring in the power of nature to make that infrastructure you know, sustain itself better in the long term. One other big issue that we have with uptake of nature-based solutions is around the lack of evidence and a business case for what works over time. So we know that there's a lot happening at the local level, but in terms of the evidence base to be able to sell these solutions as viable and competitive in relation to the conventional approaches is still lacking. I think one final element that I'd like to bring in terms of challenges that we have at this point is the scale element, because there's a lot of pilots and small small trials of nature-based solutions, but we're lacking the scale at which nature-based solutions can be deployed. And so if we tackle these three elements, we can get a long way to encouraging uptake.
Thank you very much for this insight from an expert on nature-based solutions. Before we move to the next presentation, I would quickly want to ask our regie. We have a word cloud, I guess, on the first question that we have asked on bottlenecks. Okay, we have it now on screen. I will have to look here because all the other things are so small. I think everybody almost who responded said the problem is insufficient funding, and another one, we have always done in such way. So there is a certain inertia to do it in another way. And then we have some more points, but I will not further elaborate on that. Thank you very much. So we go back to the presentation mode. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Divya Sharma. She's the Deputy Head of Cooperation with the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation in New Delhi, and she's working, or her work in India focuses on offering Swiss expertise in climate change and environment for innovative actions in rural, urban, and mountain landscapes. Divya has more than 25 years of development and cooperation experience working in the field of climate change, adaptation, natural resource and environmental management, and rural economic development. Divya, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Manfred. At the outset, I would like to thank all of you, for giving us in India this opportunity to present what we are doing in this country, a very small intervention that we will be talking about, I will be mentioning in this presentation. Next slide, please. I will not go into the details of the relevance of Hindu Kush Himalaya. Isabella touched upon it. Even more importantly, while setting the stage, Marcus and Christian already mentioned, why this, third pole, relevance of that as far as water sector is concerned, already covered that. But climate change, next please. Next slide. Now, because of climate change, already in the the first presentation we saw, what we are seeing, at least in the Himalayan ecosystem, is that there's rapid glacial area loss in this entire region, which is likely to lead to, or actually already showing signs of, on one hand, water scarcity, and at the same time, more and more events, hydrological disastrous events are getting recorded. Next slide, please. I will here first start with talking about this very well recorded Kedarnath disaster of 2013, which was in the Uttarakhand state of northern India. Nearly 10,000 people lost their lives, almost $500 million of losses were recorded, economic losses were recorded because of this event. In the month of June, that is the summer of 2013, there was an extended period of heavy rainfall, which was followed by melting of the Chorabari Glacier up, north of the Kedarnath town. And on morning of June 17, there was this huge cloud burst, which led to the breach or fall of the walls of the Chorabari Glacier Lake, which led to a huge disaster actually taking place on that day itself. Next slide, please. I am again, Christian already talked about it. This is a disaster which happened in the month of February last year. What is interesting is that this disaster, while the Kedarnath disaster took place in the summer months, interestingly, the Chamoli disaster last year actually happened in the month of February, where you actually do not expect such events to take place. What happened is a side of a mountain peak actually broke through, kind of collapsed with huge amounts of, that's about 27 million cubic meters of rock and ice mass actually, came tumbling down. And as a result, there was a loss of 200 lives. Christian already mentioned it again in his presentation. But at the same time, 2 hydro power projects got destroyed, leading to losses of as high as $200 million. Again, we are not here quantifying the loss of lives, please. Now we are just counting the hard infrastructure, unfortunately, at this moment. Now, considering, this paradox of, next slide, please. Climate change induced water scarcity combined with this increased vulnerability to water-triggered extreme events in the Indian Himalayan region, SDC decided, was convinced to implement a project to enhance the climate resilience of mountain communities in this area, where we are simultaneously working on 2 separate streams. One is on water resources management, and at the same time, tackling the topic of disaster risk reduction across the different areas of Indian Himalayan region. Next slide. What I present to you today is just one of the interventions that we are undertaking as part of this project, which is on glacial lake outburst floods in South Lonak in Sikkim. If you look at the map of India on the bottom left side, you will see the Sikkim is the northernmost state in the northeastern part of the country, a rather small state, but unfortunately with nearly 13 glacial lakes, which are growing at a very rapid rate. One of them is South Lonak. South Lonak is perhaps the largest glacial lake present in the country today. It has grown very rapidly in the last 3 decades and is today almost the size of 1 square kilometer. And this future growth of this, as you can see on the right-hand side, is expected to be even larger. Please go down. Next slide, please. Of course, the government of India, thanks to, the Kedarnath event, became more and more aware and more responsive to start studying the glacial lakes. As a response to that, from 2016 onwards, the government of India actually started closely monitoring 230 glacial lakes around in the entire Himalayan belt. At the same time, because of the rapid increase of South Lonak Lake, it especially started emerging more and more in the media. Now, because of this, media sort of fix on this particular lake, what happened was many institutions started working on providing or looking at solutions which could be in place. One of the research institutions, national level research institutions, went there and set up sensors. Another organization, state level organizations, actually sent in the missions to set up pipelines to start draining the water from the lake, because they started worrying about this enormous water body. Interestingly, when the pipelines were installed, they actually ended up damaging the one of the sensors which was installed within the lake system. Following that, a third mission happened, and when they reached, they could actually remove some of the debris and created a mouth for the water to actually naturally drain out from the lake. So what was interesting is that everybody seemed to be working in a silo, and perhaps even working at some of the interventions were counterproductive to the other previous interventions that was undertaken. Now, next slide, please. In light of the fact that despite all these interventions, the lake size still kept increasing, the government of India reached out to the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation and sought Swiss expertise to start working on this topic in a more integrated or in a more comprehensive manner. And here we actually worked with we reached out to the University of Zurich. Christian is part of that group who worked with us. And the first thing that we did, along with a series of experts from India, so tandems were there in India itself from across different institutions. We started first with mapping of the glacial risk across the Indian Himalayan region, and then worked on frameworks for risk mitigation as well as response. And this entire exercise resulted in the national level guidelines for the management of glacial lake outburst floods. Next slide, please. Now, as a follow-up to what happened, development of these guidelines, we were also very lucky that we were able to convince Government of India to actually pilot the first GLOF early warning system of the country. If you remember, I just in the last slide mentioned that the Swiss experts along with the Indian experts worked on mapping the risk. And what was found as a result of that risk was that, of course, the South Lonak Lake is very vulnerable, of course, for sure. But at the same time, we also found that another nearby, much smaller lake was perhaps even more vulnerable because of certain other reasons. And when we designed, when we worked towards designing this early warning system, so the preliminary design which was done, we first of all managed to convince Government of India not to look at one lake, but actually look at both the lakes together and design a system which is comprehensive. Secondly, not only to look at technological fix, but also very importantly, focus on building capacities of the communities to respond. Also have stakeholder consultations, bring even hydropower, in the river system, there are multiple hydropower systems, bring them on board for consultations and also integrating them into the early warning system. What I present to you is just the design. We still have not implemented this. We hope that we will be able to take things on ground from this year onward. Next slide, please. So what has been really our learning from this exercise, which honestly we have been now undertaking since 2018. What has helped us, in terms of evidence-based planning and implementing, or moving towards implementation is first, I think, science and research. But here, what was very important, I think, was co-assessment. So it was not somebody, sitting somewhere outside doing this assessment of the lakes and presenting it to the government or institutions in India, but there was co-ownership because everybody worked together as a group, whether international experts as well as the Indian experts worked together. So there was ownership of findings within the Indian institutions as well. We were very lucky that we could actually work on, and this was because Government of India was convinced with the results that we were presenting, that integration of science actually happened in the policy. We sort of saw coherence there. And now, thankfully, we will also have an opportunity to move policy into action. And interestingly, this is with the funding coming from Government of India. So while we provide technical assistance, the actual funding, for the hardware and the software to be implemented for early warning system is expected to come from the government itself. Very close collaboration with all relevant stakeholders. So we didn't just work with the Disaster Management Authority. We brought on board many different institutions We look at bringing on board very closely work with the communities, including herders, which actually access Shakhocho Lake, the other lake that we are covering, and also the hydropower system. These projects which are along the Teesta Valley, we will be having close collaborations with them as well. We are looking at developing technical, robust, but very importantly, cost-efficient solutions. We have to remember, India, we don't have just one lake. Already, Government of India has identified and even 25 high-risk lakes, and these numbers are expected to go up, as we see more and more impacts of climate change happening. Very importantly, while we're talking about policy into action, these policies must be backed by financial allocations. It will not be possible, for state governments or separate institutions to fund this. So Government of India is expected now to set up a national mitigation fund, disaster mitigation fund, and we are expecting that it will be this fund which will end up providing, more sustainable resources for undertaking such exercises in future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Divya, for this presentation, and I think it builds also a nice bridge to the introduction that we had from Marcus and Christian about early warning systems in India. We come to the guiding question 2. Can we go back to the presentation? Exactly. Yes, we had on the last slide of Divya's presentation, she was actually giving some examples how we can improve evidence-based planning and implementation. And that will be the question for the next 10 minutes for the panelists. And I would like first to give the floor to Pedro, you as Senior Regional Advisor Disaster Risk Reduction. I think you must have a large experience from different projects, so maybe you can let us know how you can integrate in the projects that you have followed and manage, how can we integrate or improve evidence-based planning?
Thank you, Manfred, and good day to everyone, wherever you are, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this international cooperation forum. In fact, I think, where we are clear what the professor mentioned, that climate change will exacerbate hydromet disasters. This needs also to take into consideration to have...
Pedro, apologies, can you increase your voice level a little bit?
Can you hear me?
Yes, just a little bit louder. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, so I was saying that since climate change will increase severity and frequency of disasters, in particular hydromet disasters, what we need is an inclusive, systematic, and holistic approach in order to bring the disaster reduction linked to climate change adaptation, linked to natural resources management, linked to water, integrated water resources management in the whole, by the way, watershed. And I think this also can help in developing this disaster risk governance that has to be also inclusive in order to have, the ownership of everyone. It is an everyone business, not only governments, local governments, but also technicians, civil society, and communities. The second point, how to make available, these good practices and planning. I think we need to move from policies to practices, and this I think is a major point that number of countries in different projects we are doing this. But I think much more needs to be done, in particular to have access of these practices. A lot of information exists, a lot of publication exists, but accessibility is not always there. We should think even out of the box, for example, to have an interactive advisory web-based hub in order for experts, for example, to advise about what it is a tailor-made, if we can say, practices in order to really implement adaptation measures. This also goes with online training. By the way, currently we are undertaking nature-based solution training here for the colleagues of SDC in Southeast Asia and the headquarters. And it is quite intensive training with a lot of practices in order to spread this knowledge. We are also in our project, we are discussing with the ASEAN and the AHA Center for them also to establish a knowledge hub as mentioned. We should also forget that social media exists. So we need to take advantage of the social media to spread knowledge. So that is just a little bit to share with you these views right from the ground regarding evidence-based planning and implementation of adaptation measures. Any question? Thank you to you.
Thank you very much, Pedro, for these insights. Now I would like to change the perspective a little bit, and I would like to ask Amanda, who's working for the private sector, to inform us how you are factoring in climate change in the engineering projects that you are building and planning. For instance, when you're planning a wastewater treatment plan, I guess you'll have to make sure that it will be resilient to future floods. So how are you dealing with climate change in your project?
Thanks very much, and thank you for inviting me here to speak today from Scotland, Edinburgh in Scotland. So I guess we're seeing a lot of focus on mitigation and probably not as much focus on adaptation. A lot of the work that we're doing is, I guess, in to the global north. So we are privileged with centralized treatment facilities and, you know, the funding and the support to try and maintain these and upgrade these. I think the climate resilience and risk modeling has really come to be a focus topic now, and in particular, the private companies, water companies here, they are mostly private, are now needing, have a statutory duty, or will have to report under the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So they will need to report on their business and thereby their asset resilience to climate change, looking at the you know, at different scenarios. So I think this is really an emerging area, and it's good because it will be a statutory duty. So I think it will force more focus. But certainly there's, I think, you know, we're not doing enough. And I guess from a personal perspective, I think when we think about where all the emissions have come from, as we are upgrading assets in these privileged parts of the world, say, what should we also be doing in other parts of the world, which really require that resilience so much more than, for example, Scotland, where I'm based. I won't go on better.
Thank you very much, Amanda. So I would like to ask a question to Carolina, one of our resource persons. And we had this example from the Indian Himalayas. This is why I'm thinking that you are probably very well placed as Executive Director of the Mountain Research Initiative to inform us a little bit more about how we can bring evidence into adaptation planning in mountain contexts, and maybe focus a little bit on the role of science on that, because as we have mentioned, you are also a lead author of IPCC, and also what is the role of collection of data and monitoring. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manfred, for the question. And also, from my side, very grateful for the opportunity to be here and to greet also my colleagues here present and those that are joining us online. Thank you for this chance to be here with you. Regarding the question, I think one of the key things that we certainly learn from the experience of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and in particular the contribution of the Working Group 2 to the 6th assessment, is that the interconnected way in which the climate system interacts also with the natural and human system. And I think that degree of complexity is something that we are beginning to see greater evidence of. And this also translates into how we need to be looking and thinking about adaptation as well in a very much systems-oriented way. Which means we need to not only be looking at the specific climate impacts and climate risks, but also what are the key human factors and natural factors also interact with the impacts that potentially ensue. So that degree of understanding comes with a lot of data and observation, of course, and in particular over long periods of time, which allows us to also ascertain the trends and conditions under which certain impacts manifest. So it's incredibly important, and for us in the cross-chapter paper Mountains, what was also incredibly important to highlight is the degree to which the community at large and the networks involved in not only researching climate change impacts and adaptation, but also in sharing the data and information and having access to that. This is also something that is increasingly becoming quite important based on what we've been able to assess also since the 5th assessment back in 2013. And as the examples also highlight, especially from the case study in India, is also the way in which cascading risks are becoming lived experiences. This is no longer sitting in the academic literature as something that is abstract. It's actually lived experience, and it's important to recognize that this affects people. And it affects the way they live and also interact, not just within their own community, but also those that are particularly as well affected further downstream. So it is incredibly important now to also incorporate the human dimensions of that scientific knowledge and to particularly also involve social sciences and humanities as part of the package of scientific information that we also look into. And one last thing that also is important to recognize based on the IPCC recent experience is the relevance and importance of indigenous and local knowledge as well. So there are other forms of knowing beyond scientific knowledge alone. And for many of us who are working in the scientific domain, it is increasingly important for us also to be cognizant and sensitive in recognizing these other forms of knowledge in how systems work, and also increasingly now how solutions in fact work, and for whom and how. This is really important to recognize.
Thank you very much, Carolina. And with that, we want to close on this question too, but I quickly want to ask the regie to show us the word cloud, which was produced by Slido. And it seems that most people point to capacity building and data sharing, and I think with data sharing we mean probably also sharing of successful approaches, which are very important. With that, I would hand over again to Daniel.
Thank you very much. So we come to the last deep dive. After the two first case studies being more about too much water, floods and gloughs, rapid onset events, we're moving to a region that is said to be suffering heavily from climate change, being water scarce, having increased demand for water, and desperately needing solutions in how to manage water at the transboundary level. With this, you see we're going to move to Amman, to Jordan, and I welcome Mafle Al-Alawin, who is working with us, especially also on a program called Blue Peace in the Middle East. He holds an MSc on environmental sciences and specifically on water and climate change, so we could not have had a better person helping us to make a contribution in that region to see how we can improve water management. He's joined SDC in 2016, meaning that before he's been working in a variety of institutions, from governmental to INGOs, etc. So I think a multi-perspective insight into how different institutions and actor groups are acting and thinking. Mafle, thanks for joining. Do you hear us?
Yes, I hear you. Thank you, Daniel. Good evening, everybody. And thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to present one of the case study from the Middle East. As Daniel mentioned, it's actually, we are living in one of the most water scarcity region. In the same time, it's classified one of the most that will be affected by the climate change. Today, I am going to talk about one of the transboundary water basin between Jordan, Syria, and a small part in Israel, 5%, 75% in Syria, and 20% in Jordan, called Yarmouk Basin. Please, the next slide. Actually, this basin is a sub-catchment area or watershed for the Jordan River Basin, where actually it's not well managed due to some difficulties, where the climate change, one of those actually pressing, let's say, component or element. The main water resource for this basin is 50% from the surface water and 50% from the groundwater. And those are actually not treated together. And this is one of the key weaknesses of the agreement that is signed between Jordan and Syria in 1987 in managing of one of the joint dam that established and be ready in 2007 to generate electricity and in the same time to use the water. Please, the next slide. The next slide, please. So this is the dam that I'm talking about. This is actually agreed between Jordan and Syria in an agreement signed 1987 to construct a land dam in the border with capacity around 110 million cubic meter, and to use this water mostly by Jordan, because you know Jordan, one of the most water scarcity country in the world, the second, let's say, water-poorest country in the world, and then to have this water electricity used by the Syrian. But due to difficulties and some of the no cooperation between the two countries, the dam remained empty since 2007, and it's just reached to 60 million 1 year during the crisis in Syria. But there are other factors that affect why there is no water flow down, because this is actually the upstream is located in the Syrian territories of Jordan. We have, there's a study team through the Blue Peace Middle East, study this basin and prepare baseline, a study where they identify 10% of the climate change affect this, why we have no water flow down to the dam, but it's interlinked as well with the increase of the population and consequently the increase of the overpump of the groundwater, which contribute around 50% of having this dam is not full. In the same time, there is a poor international coordination between Jordan and Syria, and they estimated this actually around 40% affect the dam. It's not being filled by the water from upstream country, Syria. Please, next. And if you look to this slide, we actually took two photos, one in 2021, where we had no real rainfall in the region and the country in the basin. And the second one is taken in 2019, where we have relatively better rainfall. And you can see the difference in the green vegetation, the green cover. In 2021, it's dry, as my previous colleague mentioned, my colleague, regarding the drought. But here, at least we have much better water, not that much, but you can see water flow down, and there is a green cover, show that this is a good season compared with 2021. And in this table, we analyzed the agreement that signed between Jordan and Syria, and we identify 17 parameters in how to have good water treaty or agreement. And as you can see, just this agreement just meet two conditions out of those parameters. Means this is bad an agreement. It's badly developed. It is a specific. Why? Because it's addressed the establishment of the dam and the shared the benefit, electricity and water. The second, the established committee. But imagine that this committee doesn't meet, and specifically after the Syrian crisis, they haven't met since 2011. And the climate change or any changes were not considered in this treaty because there are some changes might be happened in the future, and any good agreement or model agreement should be reviewed from time to time because there are new factors need to be considered, but this is not the case. Now that climate change is out of this agreement, and therefore there is a lot of voices now asked to review this agreement to address the climate change and the groundwater, and there is no monitoring system or mechanism agreed within this agreement. Please to the next slide. Here the research team identifies some measures that can be bilaterally implemented by the two countries in how to control the overuse of these water resources, specifically the surface and the groundwater, through control the water pumping and the version of the surface water, establishing water management roadmap. And we here, when we say roadmap, we more actually move toward having wide basin agreement, not just for the dam, because there are so many other factors like the ecosystem that is not considered in the agreement. There's no any actually join the project. Here is talk about water allocation and electricity rather than management and sustainable management of the water resources. Sharing the data is not exist at all now. This is one of the key gaps still we need to be addressed or work on it. Developing joint water agronomical project as well, monitoring water resource together. This is not the case yet. So is there a need for joint mechanism body for the two countries? I think this would be one of the key question or the gap that we need to discuss if we need to have more sustainable management of these shared water resources. Please, next slide. Next, please.
I'm clicking, but it doesn't move.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. And then the research team, the Blue Beast research team, identifies some measures that can be implemented, taken at national level. Because, if we want to manage this at transboundary, cross-border, let's say level, there are some measures need to be implemented with this basin inside this country, like reduce evaporation and evapotranspiration, because the temperature is increased. Usually we will notice more increase in the temperature here, and they identify some measure like mulching, construct, for example, shelter belts, windy breaks, and other. Install evaporation, for example, barriers. Water harvesting is very important at two levels, for example, at big level, let's say in farm or in small, let's say, dams. At the same time, to have this actually implemented at household level to harvest the water for the people who have been increased as well, and the water demand as well continued increased due to the actually the climate change, the drought, the agricultural sector within or the practices within this basin. Then they actually identify some measures to recharge the groundwater, because the groundwater being depleted, there are more than 5,000 illegal wells used in this basin, and they overpump the groundwater. And here they actually propose some measure that we can taken by those countries to recharge this groundwater. As you remember, it's contribute 50% in the water flow in this basin. So next, I think this is the last. Thank you so much. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Mafle. Yes, the question related to this third and last case study presentation has also been put on Slido, so please continue reacting, the audience physically present here and also those virtually connected. one could be negative when listening to the situation in the Middle East. At the same time, I think that it gives us an opportunity and hope, because if there's a lot that can be addressed through a joint mechanism, for instance, as you were mentioning, that would be helpful at the national level or at the transnational level, it means that we have also potential to improve the situation, to address climate change. And I think this is not what we should forget, that there's always opportunities. I would like now to turn to Marie-Jeanne. I know that you've been to the World Water Forum in Dakar, your home country, last week. And of course, your region has also similar challenges on sharing water between different countries. How do you see the situation there, and how do you relate that to the presentation of Mafle from the Middle East?
Thank you, Daniel. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry for the quality of my voice, because I have a quite intense week last week during the World Water Forum. It was quite interesting. And when it comes to the presentation, I really thanks to the minister who presented the cases in Jordan about the transboundary water governance and management. In the West African region, more specifically, as you may know, there was a kind of drought in the 17th and 18th that led to water scarcity in the region, and this situation led two countries to build a kind of joint initiative in terms of cooperation, and to build institutional framework and legal framework to better take into account this water crisis. And in this framework, as you may know, the OMVS, the Senegal River Basin Authority, was created, and after the Gambia River Basin Organization was created afterward. And this both basin organizations have learned from this situation and have created a lot of opportunities between countries, and it just put the transboundary, how I can say, the international waters in the center of the climate crisis. As you may know, in West Africa, I will not say that we have quite a very strict water scarcity. We have water. It might have a kind of variability depending on the local or on the region, but we are more facing economic water scarcity. Does this mean that there is availability of water, but there is a lack of infrastructure to make this water available to the population? And as now we are facing the climate change, there is increasing of the population, there is an increasing of the economic demand. So we need to catalyze all these experiences from the regional scale, from the basin scales, to see how we can avoid crisis in the future. As you may know, people are saying that the water might be the water crisis might be the future crisis in the future, but there are hopes. There is hopes in the region, and I'm really glad to say that in West Africa we have a very nice initiative between the countries and between the local people also, because in my experience, I've been working from the local to the global scale from now, for my short experience. So I've been facing the climate crisis and the climate challenges in different perspectives, and I've seen different solutions that have been developed from the local to the regional scales. So I'm just pointing out these ideas right now because combating or developing adaptation actions at these scales will not be possible without cooperation. So at this point, I'm also happy to say that I am supporting a bonding initiative in West Africa also to support or to catalyze all this effort that have been made between countries, and to catalyze all this effort and to promote the water diplomacy between countries and between basin organizations also. So this is the main argument that I wanted to share with you here, and to tell you that I am kind of optimistic in the future, because I'm sure that solution can be found. Can be found, and people are in West Africa more specifically. We have the experience now in how to address these challenges, but there are still challenges to be addressed. Most of the first of the challenges is capacity building, because when it comes to adapt to climate change, it also comes to innovation, it comes to technology, it comes to development, technology development. So we need to have this, how I can say, this capacity building developed in the project, and also the investment on water. As I said, we have the availability of water in West Africa, but the problem is how to mobilize the resources and how to more integrate the budgeting issues, or the budgeting and into the plannings on all sectors, because we still have this gap in terms of the lack of coordination between sectors in West Africa. And the last point is about the integration of ecosystem management into transboundary management. As in West Africa also, as I know in other countries or in other part of the world, water people are still working and all about development of dams and all this development of water for water supply, or for access water to for the agriculture and farming and other farming sectors. But we need to integrate more the biodiversity and the ecosystem and all about the wetlands management into water planning management at the transboundary level. I believe that if these challenges can be are integrated into planning and management, I believe that we could hope to a better future for water and climate. Thank you.
It's us thanking you, Marie-Jeanne. That was very nicely presented. And yes, just think a few thousand kilometers more east would be the same opportunity. Ethiopia, Egypt, Sudan, the Grand Renaissance Dam, and the collaboration is not where it is in West Africa, and we can imagine the potential outcomes on both ends are different. Daniel, you're still with us, and thanks for having been patient and staying with us. What can the World Bank do to stimulate governments, on one hand, on their own territory, to integrate more into the strategies and the policies, and then their implementation, the needs for a better water management? And how can you even eventually stimulate a better collaboration between countries in the same region?
So thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and greetings from Bishkek in the Kyrgyz Republic. I mean, there's a number of ways that the World Bank and all the development partners can really stimulate more investment, not just in water management, but in climate change adaptation. I mean, the obvious one is to really ensure that national climate change adaptation strategies or national disaster risk management strategies are really linked to financing. We've often seen the case that these kind of very ambitious and very progressive strategies, they're great, but they're often a bit delinked from the actual financial movements and the investments. And I think we have a big role to play to really help make that link. And for example, as part of our current climate change strategy, we are rolling out country climate and development reports, which really highlight the link between development, climate, resilience, water, and that it has a macroeconomic impact as well as, of course, very importantly, human impact. I think we also need to be very opportunistic. I mean, let's be clear, we're running out of time, as we've heard during this session. So whatever opportunities are afforded, we go for it. An interesting one I wanted to highlight is the pandemic, which of course has been a terrible experience for all of us. But in our very large response in terms of recovery financing, we are pursuing and working with the governments to pursue a grid approach to recovery, a green, resilient, inclusive development approach. So it's green, it supports climate mitigation, it's resilient, it supports climate adaptation, and it's inclusive. We leave no one behind. And the EU and their recovery and resilience facility, similar approach is being pursued. So it's not just us doing that. In terms of really helping to motivate more financing and more investment in this topic, I think it's been made clear throughout the session that the financing is simply not enough. There's not enough money out there being invested in the water sector and in climate adaptation. I think we need to accept to a certain degree that the international development funds will never be enough. Everyone tries to do as much as they can, but it's limited, the resources that are at our fingertips. So we look more and more at concessional financing, where we try to combine grants with loans and credits to make it more attractive to borrow money or to mobilize money to invest in climate adaptation and the water sector. And I think this is particularly true when you start looking at transboundary and regional initiatives. Obviously, everyone has their own benefits they want to gain out of this kind of regional collaboration, and they're willing to put their own money into activities that benefit themselves. But by injecting some concessional financing, some grants, that also helps motivate more financing for activities that benefit the region, and actually recognize that regional investments like this, they support the public good regionally as well as globally. It's really recognizing that climate adaptation and better water resources management is a global and regional and national public good. I think also the access to technology, we've heard a bit about this through all the different presentations today. This is also critical, whether it's improved Earth observation systems, processing tools, data sharing systems, things like that. I mean, this is critical to really motivating a more transboundary approach and keeping it very transparent. And I think transparency is key to building trust and building cross-boundary investment. Finally, as a last point, again, recognizing that the scale investment needed is simply not enough if you look only at the public sector finances. And we have a tendency, for those of us working in international development or humanitarian aid, we think about public finances, but public finances are tiny compared to the private finances that are circulating around the globe. And I think we really need to understand how to better crowd in, as we call it, the private sector, to help the private sector understand the benefits to investing in better water resources management, better adaptation, and also to help use public money to help de-risk potential private investments, to make it more attractive. So not only are there more benefits to be had, but perhaps less risks for investors themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, from late hour in Bishkek, I assume. I would like to ask the Régie to quickly show the word cloud with the responses from the audience to the question. And yes, there's a clear favorite in the center of the cloud, market-based instruments. So it's clearly linked to finance, and I think that's one part, and private sector, etc., that is a possible pathway to improve the situation. We will not be able, and we apologize for that, to respond or take up your questions, but they're not lost. We will be providing kind of a summary of the whole session, including the final discussion that will now be moderated for a few minutes by Manfred, which will be displayed on the website of the whole forum. So nothing is going to be lost, and we will even try to see whether we can provide some answers to the questions later on, as I'm mentioning now. So we come to the last short segment where we also want to have you active, but Manfred, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. We are now moving to the wrap-up part, and I have a little challenge for our panelists and resource persons. We have the concluding question is how to shape an ideal enabling environment to support the implementation of adaptation actions. And the challenge is that I want you to respond to this question in 1 or 2 sentences, just mentioning the single most important element. And then maybe we can build on that. And I think this time we might start with our resource persons, and I would just like to give Carolina Adler the floor.
Thank you. I've only got 2 sentences, so I need to be brief. The key things, coming from a scientific background and also dealing with data and information as part of the projects that we implement through adaptation at altitude, it's become incredibly clear for us. Knowing where we collect data from and from whom matters just as much as how many are out there collecting data. And for adaptation, what is critical is also learning more about how it's being implemented. And learning more about how it works.
Thank you very much. That was as brief and clear as I wished. Then I would like to ask the same question to Maria Ana Borges from IUCN.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think what's vital, well, freshwater systems provide vital services. And when they're harnessed correctly, they can bring multiple benefits. And I think the first thing that is really needed is to have a better understanding of these multiple benefits. For that, I think standardized approaches to deploying nature-based solutions is key. And IUCN has a standard, a global standard that can help do this and help cascade impact and monitoring up the chain from local to global. And finally, and I think a lot of people have touched on this, finance and investment to scale nature-based solutions is vital as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And just to inform you, we have the same question also on Slido. And again, we would like to show a word cloud at the end. So maybe if the audience here and also the online audience can contribute to that would be good. So the third resource person, Daniel Kuhl.
So I'll just repeat something I said before, and that's make sure all public financing is green, resilient, and inclusive.
That's the new benchmark for answers.
They're becoming shorter and shorter. So we move back to the panelists. Let me start with Isabella.
Thank you. So to make sure that we reach those who are most vulnerable in the most fragile regions in the world, those most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change on water, we need far more solutions that are practical, accessible, and implementable by those who are on the ground, but also complement those with the right political, economic, and social incentives. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to Amanda.
I think we need to think about these things more every day in every aspect of our work, even if it seems unrelated. And if we're not part of a solution in supporting the adaptation required, then we need to consider that we're part of the problem and really question our role as humans on this lovely planet And I think we also need to tell more stories about the futures we need and the futures that we're facing and why that matters. I think more water stories are really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Pedro, please.
Thank you. Let me highlight the key issue of convergence. It is very important for the holistic approach. We cannot speak now anymore about climate change and DRR separately. We need to tackle the issue together. Climate change, adaptation, mitigation, DRR, natural resources management, in order to promote joint policies, joint mechanisms for implementation, and on top of that, to optimize resources and financing. As you may recall, Switzerland promoted coherence, mutual recognition, and complementarity of international agreements in a framework, SDGs, Paris Agreement. The several regions also, they have integrated agreements, such as in the Pacific or the African Union, but much more needs to be done at the national level. And I think this coherence between these policies is important in every single country, but we maybe not be able to deal with every country. My suggestion is to use and to work very closely with intergovernmental organizations that exist all around the globe in order to tackle a number of countries in this coherence in order to move towards climate and risk governance inclusively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Now we move to our two panelists which are here. I would like to ask Rupa to start.
So I would like to build on what the others said and emphasize that data, knowledge, technology need to move to the local level, because too little money is going to the local level, too little money for adaptation, and out of that a tiny fraction to the local level. And these are the people who have to respond to demands of the citizens. So more action at the local level. And the second would be policies that ensure that water is treated as an economic good, because it's undervalued, managed. And the third, to increase water literacy, because we didn't talk enough about groundwater, but that's a very important piece of the puzzle. And also the whole nature-based solutions for recharge and retention as well. So enhancing and investing in water literacy.
Thank you very much. And then the last word, I would say, to the generation that has to take the brunt of what the future generation has created.
Thank you. So my part, I say that it might be more, it might be interesting or more relevant to consolidate, how I can say, all the solution in terms of integration of risk assessment into budgeting and planning in other sectors. This is a really, really important point that I really want to emphasize. The second point is to engage more youth into a program or project or policy into regarding the climate change and water-related issues. The third point will be, it's already addressed by Rupa about engaging more local communities in terms of technology, or to support more the local communities who are facing the most the climate crisis. So in this point, I will just support your idea to engage more the local community and to take more into account the technology and the finance issue also for infrastructure for water. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this was an extremely rich session, and now I stand between you and the reception, so I will be very short. But let me try to wrap up with a little story, which I actually steal from the director of ISIMOD. I've just learned it today, a little quote. A student was asking a teacher, saying, I have a clear destination. I know where I want to go. And I have a winding, difficult path which might me bring to this destination sooner or later. On which do you have to focus more? On the destination or on the path? The teacher was telling him, look, both your path you're following and your destination are equally important. But what is even more important is the company that you get on your path. And I think I found this is a nice way to close this session, because here we wanted to get your collective intelligence. We are not alone on this path. The path, we could call it climate resilient development pathways. And we know the aim or the destination. We have to limit warming below 1.5 degrees. But we can only achieve this together, and we need really to share solutions, discuss them, and work together. And to do that, we have two more options for you to share what you have learned today or what you have known before, but it hasn't been presented here. So we have these knowledge walls that you might be familiar with now from other sections already. You can go to the homepage of the website of the ICE Forum, still share your additional thoughts and inputs. And then there is also an online space, I think, called Spatial Chat for the people who just participate online here, because we can now go to the reception and do the informal networking with a nice drink, but you can at least go to the Spatial Chat and continue to discuss with people who attended this session. So with that, I really want to thank everybody very much which attended this session, both online and physically present, and shared their insights. Thanks a lot, and with that, maybe I hand for the final word to Daniel.
Together we're better.